Welcome to another episode of Living with FASD, an informational and human interest show for those affected by prenatal alcohol spectrum disorders, their loved ones, and anyone else wanting to learn more about an FASD. My name is Patti Kasper. I'm your host and your FASD coach. And this week, I am so excited to bring to you Joel Sheagren, who is the director, producer, and photographer. He is co-founder and president of Hope and Rescue Foundation, and it's a nonprofit doing great stuff, all sorts of very important projects. One of the ones that is near and dear to him is human trafficking. And the other thing that is near and dear to him is FASD. So I will let Joel talk to you about what brought him to that, and just welcome, Joel. I'm so glad to have you on the show.
Well, thanks for having me. It's an honor. So, somewhere going to the human trafficking and the nonprofit Hope and Rescue, um, to that piece. I'm a commercial photographer serving the advertising agencies, and that kind of metamorphed into directing commercials and film. And around 2006, I was exposed to the issue of human trafficking in Minnesota. And my daughter was 2 years old at the time. And I said, not on my watch,
Mhm.
is kind of how that began. And from there, I ended up asking an ad agency to do an ad campaign. And they took on a nonprofit called Not for Sale that was just getting started in California at the time. And the agency said yes. And they put somewhere between $300,000 and $500,000 of their own time pro bono into that project. And
Wow.
it felt really good. I was kind of the engine behind the scenes, so to speak.
Mhm.
And, the door almost closed on them more than once. And I would just get a phone call in the afternoon on a Sunday afternoon from the ad agency. Oh, the window's shutting. He said, what do we need to do? And I would kind of play um, fixer-upper in the background. And we eventually launched that campaign. I was part of filming um, a public service announcement, a PSA that won a Clio, and that kind of out of that experience, the nonprofit really does great work, but they had no idea how to manage a ad campaign. And I thought,
Mhm.
shoot, that's my specialty. And
Mhm.
um, so let's form a nonprofit that can tell stories.
Yeah.
And that eventually has become this financial sponsor, the sponsor behind the Embrace project for the FASD. And I had a dream. So now to transition over to the FASD
Yeah.
side, um, I had a dream where my wife and I would be handed this little boy in a blanket, and I just, it was vivid enough that it stuck with me. And I
Mhm.
just thought, oh my goodness, and I wrote it down, and I wondered if it might be metaphorical with regards to there was a little boy and he was soon joined by a little girl, and a bunch of other stuff took place. Well, fast forward about 6 to 8 months, and we were asked out of the blue to adopt this little boy. And I was like, oh, yes. And we were asked without having ever been on an adoption list or even seriously talking about adoption. And so that was
So it was a private adoption, or were you foster parents?
it was a private,
Okay.
we were at a conference and somebody just asked us, who we had met 30 minutes earlier, if we wanted to adopt.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And we were not on an adoption list. We weren't doing foster care. We were going to Mexico to a children's home. And of course, you want to come home with a kid. I mean, they're just the proxy to a young, but no serious conversation. We had
Mm-hmm.
never pursued it. And I blurted out yes as soon as her name was Diane asked us. And I remembered the dream
Mm-hmm.
as I was saying the word yes. It was just that fast. And
Yeah.
a week later, Diane introduced us to the birth mother. And so we have an open adoption.
Mm-hmm.
And we brought our son home. That was the first that they asked was the first weekend in August, and we brought our son home legally ours by mid-October
Wow.
from the hospital. And the birth mother was honest with us. She
Mm-hmm.
told us all about her prenatal alcohol use,
Mm-hmm.
but we were naive. I don't know that it would have made a difference, but we became good friends with the birth mother, and
Mm-hmm.
my wife would go to coffee with her, and uh, she would come over for her birthday. And 2 years later, she asked us to be in the birthing room for our daughter.
Oh,
So
wow.
we helped our daughter uh, in the birthing process.
Mm-hmm.
So pretty cool experience. And
So
fast,
was your daughter also exposed to alcohol?
yeah. So
Okay.
we can circle back to some of the statistics and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
So she's been impacted by it, but she doesn't have any of what we would call the behaviors
Okay.
in those regards. She's studying mechanical engineering uh, right now in college, so
Good for her.
good for her. She loves math and
Yeah.
uh, has a strong friend circle and knows the difference between right and wrong and cause and
Mm-hmm.
effect and all of those kinds of things. So remarkable young lady. But it took us 14 years to really come to terms and to understand the root cause behind our son's disruptive behaviors, if you
Yeah.
will,
Yeah.
to understand the symptoms of where things were coming from. And that process is like I was already as a filmmaker, a photographer, self-employed, and everything has shifted to home. And so it was easy for me to care for the kids already. And I
Mm-hmm.
was doing that. And it became even more so uh, important for me to stay home, be a stay-at-home dad. Once we had the diagnosis
Yeah.
of what was going on, and I just really wanted to focus my time on how to better parent my son. It's a
Yeah.
completely different paradigm.
Yes, it is.
Um, yeah, so and I know your listeners are probably pretty familiar with this issue, but one of the paradigm shifts, an easy one, is my son's name is Sam. So, hey, Sam, can you wash the dishes? And you get the pushback.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Yada, 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 yakety, yakety, yak. And you move towards him in a normal, traditional parenting
Mm-hmm.
sort of situation. And that only escalated stuff. If you went, don't
Yeah.
be disrespectful. You need
Yeah.
to get out here and wash the dishes.
Yep.
And learning about processing speed, I would say, hey, Sam, in 5 minutes, can you come help out and do the dishes? And you still
Mm-hmm.
might get the yada, 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 and the pushback, but I
Mm-hmm.
would ignore it. And being wired for justice, that was really hard. And you just walk away, and guess what? 5 minutes later, he's up doing dishes or vacuuming or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
And it just made all the difference in the world to have that
Yeah.
appropriate understanding. And
Yeah.
um, so anyway, those kinds of parenting interventions, strategies, perspective. And as I was doing the research on that, it's hard not to see other neuroscience stuff and
Mm-hmm.
statistics that are like, what?
Yeah.
Like 25 to 50% of our prison population is FASD. And it's like,
Yeah.
what?
Yeah.
And I think verifiable, we're in the neighborhood of 30%, both men and women.
Yeah.
And so,
I
but
believe that's what
I
it is
was
here
seeing
in
all sorts of,
California.
what's that?
I think that's what the statistic is here in California is 30%, I
Yeah, and you can
think.
find all sorts of different numbers, but you really have to go to the source and find
Yeah.
out,
Yeah.
uh, are they making it up or not?
Yeah. I believe that's
Because
also the stats for our homelessness population here as well.
yeah, and so seeing those statistics, I started putting dots together, knowing what I know about human trafficking, that,
Mm.
oh my word, here's a driver. Here is a reason, because if I've heard that, or there's plenty of research around homelessness
Mhm.
feeds human trafficking. And I say, well, back up in the domino line
Yeah.
is mental health, and FASD is a significant contributor of
Yeah.
mental health, right?
Right.
So let's start there. And the lack of understanding, I think the word is dearth.
Hmm.
We just don't have anything
Yeah.
of a national scale.
Right.
And so I started putting together some thoughts and some ideas for a documentary, and that kind of metamorphed into, well, let's add a narrative to it, because rightfully so, we as parents don't want to tell our kids stories. They
Hmm.
are tough.
Hmm.
And it's a major reason, I believe, why we don't know anything about this issue.
Yeah.
People don't want to talk about their drinking during pregnancy. We don't want to talk about our kiddos' stories. And
Yeah.
so let's create a character that works much like a docudrama,
Hmm.
where you're telling a fictional story of an individual so that it can represent the spectrum, and
Right.
let's interweave those interviews, um, from
And
the
I
professionals, the caregivers, and
yeah. I think we had this same dynamic with the autism spectrum. 3 decades ago, women were shamed, and autism was felt to be caused by emotionally unavailable women. So, of course, they're not going to pipe up with their story and identify their children. And I think that you hit the nail on the head with not sharing our stories has a lot to do with the ongoing invisibility of this condition.
yeah. And so out of that, at one point, I started collecting other people like Jodee Kulp, who
Mm-hmm.
we all know, who's one of the major forces behind Red Shoes Rocks, and written I
Yeah,
don't know how many books on FASD,
yeah.
and she's here in the Minneapolis area. And so we got together, and I had an immediate cheerleader,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
confidant, and we went to dinner, my wife and I, and her and her husband went to dinner right away, and we're here for you. We know it gets lonely, and I don't
Yeah.
think the world knows how lonely and isolated we can get. And
Oh,
that's
yeah.
not a
Yeah.
woe is me. It's just the reality
Right.
of,
Right.
you need people around you during this journey. And so,
Yeah.
uh, so anyway, Jodee became a is a dear friend. And we, in the process of trying to put together the documentary, it's a little bit harder uphill battle, because I'm not just collecting interviews. I'm collecting interviews with a very specific focus to put
Right.
story behind it. And I have wanted to do, kind of out of the chute, let's do a family story, let's do a classroom situation, criminal justice, the medical
Mm-hmm.
side, and let's finish with stories of hope. That was
Yeah.
kind of the initial. And then we would weave this fictional character in and out of that process of those different themes. And so that kind of metamorphed into other stuff. This project just kept growing out from underneath
Mhm.
me. And Justin Overlander eventually came along and he had said, well, why don't we just do a single narrative? Uh, and we just weave those themes into that narrative. And so we kind of shifted gears. But just before Justin came on, I sat down to write a grant, and I specifically picked one that I had enough time to work on what we call a treatment, where you outline what the plot lines are, where you're going to go with it. You can copyright a treatment, uh, and you can sell a treatment, so somebody else can pick it up and write the script.
Mhm.
And I set out to do that specific around a story of an individual's, a school story, and I had a yeah, I can talk, a fictional character that I was weaving back in. And I focused on the creative side of rocketry,
Mhm.
wanting to see the stars, and it would be in a classroom setting. And we would start with the home situation, and mom wouldn't really know what was going on. And she fed to the overload of stimuli
Mhm.
that would happen in the day. And eventually it would be uh, a school alteration. And it wasn't because of our kiddo with FASD, but people not understanding the
Right.
processing speed, the sensors,
Right.
the
Right.
green lights from fluorescence, etc. And Jodee fed into helping me write that.
Mhm.
I
So
did.
I'm curious, what led to you choosing this? Well, first of all, the character, as I understand it, is kind of an amalgamation of all the interviews that you had done, right?
Correct.
It's a composite, right?
Yes.
Um, but what led you to choose his particular hobbies and interests?
Well, one of the things that my son is really excellent at is art and really likes the stars. We were having a report here in southern Minnesota that we were going to see the aurora borealis, right?
Mm.
And my son, we want to go, and he's got cameras and he's up all night trying to watch the aurora. And uh, my faith journey goes back to the stars. And so it was kind of all of that.
Okay.
I did not believe there was a God when I
Mhm.
was younger, and I sat under the stars for two summers, and I soon shifted that there's a designer
Mhm.
uh, to all of this. And
Yeah.
so the stars have played a big part of my life, and rocketries as a parent and child activity. You go get the SD rockets and you
Yeah.
blast them off in the soccer fields. And so we had a lot of fun with all that,
Yeah.
and the art piece. So in the school story that he hand painted it, and he really put a lot of love into it, right? And so that's going to be destroyed in that school setting because kids are bullies and they
Yeah.
push things over, etc. So that's kind of how it got anchored. And Jodee had a big part of, well, make sure that what we're calling Zach, our composite character is called Zach, and make sure at the time it wasn't, but make sure that Zach starts in a dark room at home because all of our kiddos have their lights turned off, and
Yeah.
which is true. My son has a whole string of you might call them Christmas lights.
Yeah.
They glow 24/7 in his room. He never turns
Mhm.
on the light switch unless he needs to find something.
Yeah.
Um, that's just our kids have sensory overloads. And so, anyway, all of those components were thought through for this grant and how
Mhm.
we were going to weave that into a interview piece. And I knew full well that we weren't going to get the grant, but I used it as an anchor for a deadline.
Mhm.
Um, and it would provide another anchor point for the film, that we would have an asset. And about the time we were done with that, my friend Justin Overlander, who's part of this project, he had been part of another film. I'll let him talk about all of that. And I knew he had stepped away from that film. And so I called him up or texted him and I said, hey, let's go to coffee. And we did. And I talked this big vision about where things were at this point, and he didn't have any clue what FASD was. And he gave me a polite no.
Mm-hmm.
But he said, I will read your materials. And one of those were the school story. And as a filmmaker, I think that helped
That
move
piqued his
the needle.
interest.
Yeah. And then also he did his own research, and he called me back a week later and said, I need to be a part of this. I have to be a part of this.
Yeah.
And the project has lots of roots for our personal experience.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew that our son had gone to 9 schools to get graduated from high school, 9. And that was supplemented by, I don't know how many therapies and how many after school programs. And
Mm-hmm.
there's not one professional that understood anything about this. In fact, his play therapist of 5 years, and I connected on LinkedIn after my son was diagnosed.
Mm-hmm.
And I had just said, this, what's going on? And her response was, oh, I need to learn. Our son's pediatrician at the time, when we were just having a casual conversation about, I'm thinking about moving forward on this documentary. Oh, I'd love to learn more about that. Nobody knows in the
Yeah.
professional world. And
Yeah.
here is at least twice as prevalent as autism.
Yeah. Yeah.
When I started the research, it was 3 times, and now it's double. And
I
go ahead.
I think it's probably going to be going back up. I mean, from what I understand, that the prevalence of autism spectrum is increasing, but I don't think it's increasing as quickly as the prevalence of FASD. Um, so there was somebody I was reading just the other day said that it has recently been verified, the stat that Dr. May came out with, he talked about in September, the National Impact Week, that it was 6.7% instead of 5. So that's 1 in 15. So that's a lot more than the accepted 1 in 20. But even that statistic, when he came up with that, was before COVID.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
before the major coping mechanism during the lockdowns of drinking.
Yeah.
Um, so I think we are going to far outpace the autism spectrum diagnosis
Well,
before
and I'm
long.
thankful our son has a dual diagnosis. We've had 3 neuropsychs done since age 14. He's now 21. And the recent one was just before he turned 21.
Mm-hmm.
And they anchored autism as part of it. And it's probably not autism, it's probably the symptoms of autism,
Yeah,
the rigidity, the
yeah,
adaptability, the social skills. But I'm super thankful, because we get services.
yeah,
Nobody has services
yeah. There's a
that we,
lot of overlap. Yeah.
yeah. And so my son's FASD gets fed to the autism, or I'm sorry, the autism diagnosis, the dual diagnosis
Mm-hmm.
feeds the autism numbers.
Yeah,
And at some point, there'll be a study that'll separate that. And then all of a
yeah,
sudden, it's going to be astronomically more. Um,
yeah,
so we can circle back to that, because I
yeah.
really believe
And
those numbers.
someone can genuinely have both diagnoses and both conditions, but I think it's a misdiagnosis more often than not,
Yeah. And
or a partial
yeah,
diagnosis.
yeah, I was going to say the number is close to 9 out of 10. That the study that Dr. Ira Chesnoff did, of our kiddos being misdiagnosed. I think
Mhm.
part of that framing is that it is not so much a misdiagnosis, though it's an underdiagnosis.
Yeah.
And, the autism tells a part of the story. And
Yeah.
our son definitely has the traits of autistic rigidity. No, it was at 10:01, not 10 o'clock. And then you get stuck into, unless you know how to deal with that, into the thing that's not even important, right? It's like about 10 o'clock. No, it was, so it's a uphill battle in that regard. But I think part of it is I don't want my son to be finding his identity in that diagnosis, in that diagnostic assessment, right? He's also highly, highly creative and warm human being that wants to help change the world, and he can do math well. He was top of his game in soccer until the game got too fast. He always played a level or two up. And so when he was 16 playing against 18, there's a huge difference in the speed of the game. And he wasn't keeping up half the time. And he said, I don't want to play next year. So,
yeah. I think that there's a fine line, right? Because our society is very diagnosis based, right? Disability focused. And yet, I mean, we have to play that up in order to get services, but we have to be strength based in order to get our loved ones with FASD to believe in themselves and build on their strengths and not get sucked down a depressive cycle. So it's a fine line and it's a tough dance sometimes.
yeah, and I've been fortunate as that stay-at-home dad to wear 2 or 3 cars out driving to what we call the North Shore of Lake Superior. It's about a 2.5, 3 hour drive to go rock hunting. Our son absolutely loves agates and the science behind rocks. He could tell you all sorts of names of rocks, right? Could he be a geologist? Probably. He's most certainly a rock hound. And we've created art out of those
You
rocks.
could probably tell me what this is.
He probably could. I would guess that it's
Yeah.
in the neighborhood of amethyst, but it's not purple, so I don't know.
Right. Yeah, it's a real pale blue, but I use it as the analogy of, with kids who have been in the system, they're just kind of run down and not anything special to look at, but there's so much beautiful stuff within.
Oh my goodness.
Right.
Yeah, my son has been really, really focused on songwriting. Loves music in the modern hip hop of and R&B and all of those kinds of stuff. And the glimpses I get, he's got this has nothing to do with his FASD. He's got more of a number 5 on an Enneagram. He's just a deep thinker and quiet. And so we don't get a lot out of him in terms of songs. And a couple of weeks ago, I took my in-laws, his grandma and grandpa, to the airport, and it was an hour drive or more to go down. And my mother-in-law asked him, well, can I hear some songs? And so I got to hear some songs. They're really, really good. And so you need to be more public with those. You actually might earn some income. And I think part of that social anxiety is, how do I get from point A to point B? But the biggest intervention that has been successful is time. Is part of what I was saying, that I've been really fortunate to be able to be at home with our kids. And one of those schools was a public school online. So it was kind of homeschooling. And, and we would take off and we would go explore state parks and the Native American paintings on certain rocks and agate hunting and go fishing and that has paid off. He's not in jail, he's not on
Yeah.
drugs, he's at the
Yeah.
house.
Well, and so much goes wrong in public school for our kiddos because there's the lack of education, right? None of us knew what we didn't know until we finally learned it. And unfortunately, there is that dearth of education around FASD in all systems. Social services, where I hail from, education, policy makers, I mean, all of it. There's just ignorance, and our kids end up blamed, shamed, and punished for the effects of their disability that they didn't ask for. And
Yep.
it really feeds the school to prison pipeline for a lot of our kids.
Yeah. And so out of that school experience of having 9 schools going back to the project,
Mm-hmm.
it really made sense that we train professionals as
Yeah.
part of this. And how do we take,
Yeah.
so if I need, I'm going to use a random number, if I need 20 interviews for a documentary or 50, and you narrow it down to, your 10 or 12,
Mm-hmm.
I want to have 200 because I want to take those interviews from the school, from the criminal justice, people who are
Yeah.
like Ira Chesnoff in that expert side of the school, so that we can draw those interviews into the training of professionals
Mm-hmm.
in the various social workers and
Yeah. Mental health,
teachers and mental
mm-hmm.
health. The list
The
goes
legal system. Yeah.
those that arrest.
Yeah.
We have
Yeah.
had an encounter with uh, the law,
Mm-hmm.
um, and the uh, the police officers had no clue. And
Mm-hmm.
ended up interviewing the sheriff of our county for this project, and he had zero understanding of FASD, but he
Yeah.
did understand mental health. They were trained in that as a general piece.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just really fascinating of how uneducated any of those systems are
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
how much there is a need for the
Yeah.
professionals to get trained, just like autism.
Yeah. And I think too that the what all the systems have in common is the behavior paradigm, right? That says you change behavior by finding the right motivation, right? You offer the right bribe or the right punishment, and eventually they will make the choice you want them to make, except if your brain is not wired in such a way that the processes can get you there, the desired behavior is just not going to happen. Motivation doesn't undo the brain injuries that we've had before we were born.
Yeah, so there's a book out that I sat in on a book study from Dr. Ira Chesnuff on, I got it here. I forget the name of it, but it was about education in school, and they really
Mm-hmm.
advocate the mnemonic approach to teaching because you take in all the senses
Mm-hmm.
and the exponential learning, regardless of mental health or
Yeah.
neural, uh, the neural diversity, all of it goes up.
Yeah.
In terms of if your expectation is 5, you're learning on a scale of 1 to 10, your learning might be 9 or 10
Mm-hmm.
if you engage with mnemonics. And so, how do we use all of our sensories? And part of that, I think, is an app and technology. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
at least we can address a lot more of it that way. And so the project eventually I want to get to an app where we're using an interactive character of Zach
Mm-hmm.
for any age. Plug in what your strengths are, what your ages are, what your challenge, all of those kinds of things. And now you can interact with Zach, whether you are 5 or you're 65, and you play the game, and you may have impulsivity as kind of that learning objective,
Mm-hmm.
and Zach helps you learn. And
That's
whatever
great.
that's going to look like, that's much further down the project.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this Embraced has become a book that Jodee wrote. It's
Mm-hmm.
independent, but it's integrated, if you will, into the
Yeah.
project. And so
I've had the honor of previewing that and just love it.
it's hard to put down.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so here we are, October of 2024, and last October, or I'm sorry, last August, Jodee called me and said, "Hey, I'm going to start writing uh, a book about this character. Can I steal the school story?" And I said, "Of course," which had the rocketry and the
Mm-hmm.
stars and the classroom setting and all of that kind of foundation. And a couple of other folks that I've not yet met and myself were on daily with her.
Mm-hmm.
They were doing one part, and I would feed into, make sure you foreshadow this, make
Yeah.
sure that the parents are the culprits, innocently the culprits, and not
Right.
understanding their son, and those kinds of things. And Jodee took that whole story, just made it into a
Yeah.
story that's hard to stop reading.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what it provided for the project is, we're Justin, who's part of this project that I've mentioned, he's taking the book and starting to write a script.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm working on CEUs with Carl Jung for the training of professionals.
Yeah.
So weekly we jump on a Zoom and we do a bunch of
Yeah.
research, and he's presenting that training to social workers in North Dakota.
Mm-hmm.
And out of that, Carl and I told him that I was working on I'm going to come back because I'm getting into the weeds. So there's 5 components on a that we interweave our character of Zach.
Yeah.
And Jodee wrote the book that things are based on now, not just the little part that I had,
Yeah.
but rather this whole story. And that's the last 4 months of Zach's high school
Yeah.
experience, because he's been removed from uh, the classroom story that I wrote. He
Yeah.
got kicked out of school because of that. So the book, now we're taking and working on a feature film, and we're going to start there with entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll circle back to telling Zach's story from birth to high school in a documentary with
Yeah.
interviews, and they're all for different audiences.
Yeah.
And Carl and I are working in the background on the training of professionals.
Mm-hmm.
And we're focused right now on social workers because Carl's getting paid to teach social workers and is
Yeah.
recording that. So we have a prototype, if you will,
Yeah.
for what we're up to. And then eventually the app where we take Zach's character and let's just make him interactive. For age, for different inputs of impulsivity. The big ones are impulsivities, the lack of self-regulation, and
Mm-hmm.
the executive function. There's other components and other things, but those are the big ones, right? And
Yeah.
so that would be the focus. And so those are the 5 components behind that. As I've collected over 80 interviews at this point, 32-ish, 34, I forget the exact number, are in camera or in-person film quality, and the others,
Mm-hmm.
almost 50, are Zoom interviews. And so
Mm-hmm.
we've got all this content that we've developed the story. And I interviewed a particular individual 3 times, once in person. They had flown in from California. But prior to that, they had given me a school story of what transpired on Zoom, and then I got him in person, and we circled back. I want some more details.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how Zach's character got developed, was from these interviews as a specific, right? And then all these other ones, you know, in the book, Jodee has a firewood story where Zach does all of this stuff. Well, that we happened to be talking that day, and I gave her a story of my son. That's that. And everybody has fed into little bits and pieces that became this wonderful book that's hard to put down, that's yet to be published. Will be here shortly. So it's not just me, it's kind of grown out from under me, so to speak, where it's got all these components. And for us to get started in the right way, or to get, you know, from a linear standpoint, let's put the documentary aside. I can keep working on interviews, and I plan to keep doing that, but let's focus on the feature film. Because the ground is so hard, so to speak, with people's understanding of this issue. Let's entertain people. Let's have some
hang on
box
for me
success.
1 second.
Yeah.
Oh goodness. Yeah, I can't tell you how much I was thrilled to read the book and to contribute, you know, what little feedback I could, just from my own personal experiences as well as years of working with kids in the foster care system. Your project is on such a broad scope. I'm really hoping that that's what's going to kick us over the edge in terms of, you know, like the feature film, because it's entertainment, that's going to reach people that, you know, I would never reach with my book. You know, I mean, just, I'm really excited by the
Well,
potential.
thank you. It's everybody's contributed, just like we've contributed to Jodee's book. And I wish I could tell you about it, but it weaves a number of things together, including, you know, I would keep saying to Jodee, make sure that Zach is the hero with FASD, because she had supporting characters, and wanting those folks to kind of take a spot that might be more of a heroic piece. And it's natural. You look at those characters when you're reading them, and it would be real easy to want to take one of those and kind of go to the forefront. But so bless her heart that she was just really, really open to not just stealing the story or, you know, but to really take input, so that
she is an
this entire
amazing
project is,
collaborator.
oh my goodness, off the charts. And so, you know, it's all credit to her. She did the writing.
Yeah.
I just gave her she just took an idea that she helped me build and ran with it. And it's just really wonderful.
We've been talking for an hour already, Joel.
Well, let me put these 5 components into more of a business framework.
Okay.
In the world of filmmaking, when you have a book and a movie and a TV series and animations and all those kinds of things, we call that transmedia storytelling. And there's a very specific reason you do that, like Star Wars. You build a franchise, and one product reaches one audience, and then there's cross-pollination, and it builds on what is going on, right? And so in this context of Star Wars, they put together a whole TV series on a particular character that's not Skywalker. But, you know, but Skywalker plays into it. And he's, in the context of Andor, he's a character within the Star Wars world. He represents that Skywalker character, right? And other things happen in a different part of the story. And so in the context of a book tells Zach's story, and then let's tell part of that story in a different way for a different audience with a film. and then a different part of the story for a different part
Yeah.
of the audience for a
Yeah.
documentary.
Yeah.
And
And I think all the exposure from both the book and the feature film are is really going to prepare people for all the learning that will happen in the documentary.
yeah, and so I really want to stay focused on filmmaking, but I find myself becoming a nerd in neuroscience and interventions and all of this. So it's been really
Yeah.
fun, right? As
Yeah.
Carl and I, and I think you're interviewing him possibly for this project. He can
Yeah.
talk into those specifics, but you know, I was starting to write a book about the making of this project.
Mm-hmm.
And I have all of these interviews and I want to honor everyone. Not everyone's going to make it to
Yeah.
the documentary or other things.
Yeah.
And as I was writing it, it was like, oh my goodness, I've got all this neuroscience in here. And one interview might be 40 pages long. And you have 80 and I want to have 150. That's not going to work. You're going to have a
Yeah.
12,000 page book. And then as Carl and I were working on the CEUs, he was texting me, hey, we should do a book. And I'm like, time out, let's do this together. And
Yeah.
so it's super collaborative all the way
Yeah.
through. And
Yeah.
so one day we get together twice a week. And one day we work on the book,
Mm-hmm.
which is a combination of the making of and the training material. And then we try to stay ahead of his teaching schedule
Yeah.
of what he actually has. We're way ahead of schedule in a lot of ways, but it's all this neuroscience. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's becoming a textbook still, but a little bit more manageable. So from a need standpoint, if listeners want to help edit or uh, help us develop a website, we have
Mm-hmm.
lots of things and we're quite collaborative in our process
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
I might be the vision architect, but I'm hardly the linear person for
Right.
certain things. And I surprise myself with the neuroscience of just how
Mm-hmm.
linear I'm getting, right? Yeah. The other day, I traveled for a funeral, a family funeral to North Carolina. And on the way back, a gal got onto a shuttle that took us from, this letter in the terminal to another part of the terminal with a different letter. And she gets on and she has what looks like a camera case. And I said, oh, are you a photographer? And she goes, no, I'm a neuroscience surgeon. And I'm like, oh, and this is all my equipment. And so we talked. She happened to specialize in, so her particular role was to be the accountability to the actual surgeon. She knew all about the brain and she watched what the surgeon was doing. And so she was well versed in all the different parts of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And she specialized in autism and had never heard of FASD.
Wow.
It's what I did, mouth dropped. And
Right.
I
Yeah.
went
For
into a
for
linear talk
yeah.
uh, of the hippocampus or the
Yeah.
thalamus. And it's like,
Yeah.
oh my goodness,
Yeah. For
listen
the
to
people
me.
that are
Who is
listening
this
and not
guy?
watching, my chin hit the desk, right? So
Yeah, yeah. And that's it. But it is such a common thread, right? I
yeah.
wasn't so surprised. I was, and
Yeah.
my mouth did drop. But the way that I dropped was, yeah, when my son was 14, I had no idea.
Yeah.
Uh, and now I've become a bit of a nerd. I'm not anywhere
Yeah.
close to your level of understanding. But for instance, in the whole world of ADHD, and let's anyway, I'm not going to go linear at this point, but what came out of my mouth, I was kind of like looking around, like, who is this guy talking? It's neuroscience, and I was linear, and so I can get there. Uh,
Yeah.
but for the most part, my
Yeah.
gifts are really
Yeah.
juggling
So
more than one thing and casting vision. So
I think you've previously been on FASD Hope. Is that correct?
yes, with Natalie.
Uh-huh. So she interviewed me, I want to say a year and a half ago. And the episode was going to air around Thanksgiving. And oh gosh, we had talked for like an hour and a half, and she didn't want to cut it. So she was going to put it into 2 episodes, but that's when she had to take her break.
Oh, yeah.
So she had not put it up for air, but we knew it was going to be Thanksgiving time. So which is also National Adoption Month, right? And so the theme for the day was what are 5 things I wish I had known, right? Because I wrote adoption home studies for, I don't know, at least 15 years, at least, probably more than that, before I left the agency I had been working for at the time. And and I had been doing post-adoption support for 5 years with that same agency. And, having to come up with that, 5 things I wish I had known, it really was humbling.
Hmm.
What I thought I knew about how to support adoptive parents who were really struggling with their kids. Now, of course, I can point to FASD as the culprit in probably all of those cases. But at the time, I, I just gave bad advice because I had the same misunderstandings and lack of knowledge. And, it comes back to none of us knew what we don't know until we finally learn it. And I think that there's system wide, perhaps some resistance to opening your eyes and shifting paradigms, because then you have to come to terms with all the harm that you have inadvertently caused. And that's a very difficult place to be. And I
Yeah, for
think
sure.
I
Yeah, for
think
sure.
social
And
workers and therapists and even doctors, across all spectrum of service, have to wrestle with that.
and we need to give ourselves grace, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's we don't for what is it, over 90% of our kiddos, we don't see a physical trait that
Right.
represents
Right.
the what we would want to see as a physical trait to see
Right.
a disability.
Right.
And so it's remained under the radar for a lot of reasons, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, alcohol. So the way that alcohol is a big part of our culture worldwide,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't want to give that up. We don't want to tell our
Yeah.
stories, and it's not in the DSM-5,
Yeah.
and the list goes on and on
Yeah.
of why there's a
And
dearth
and
when
we
it
don't
comes
want to
to
admit how harmful it could be, because then we'd have to really take a look at ourselves.
yeah, and we need to give
Yeah.
ourselves some grace in all of that, right? I
Yeah.
mean, as a
Yeah.
parent, I beat myself up that I gave all these interventions to my son. Don't be disrespectful when you move towards him and then you end up in an altercation. The
Yeah.
reality is he didn't know what was going on and I didn't know what was going on. He doesn't
Yeah.
want to
Yeah.
behave. He doesn't wake up uh, and say I'm going to hurt and want to damage my parents and who I
Yeah.
love,
Yeah.
because he it's obvious how much he loves us, right? We spend
Yeah.
time with him and he wants to
Yeah.
be around us. And will you take me fishing? And will
Yeah.
you hang out and watch a movie with me tonight? And it's like, oh my goodness, all this time I've spent. I want to cry that he, at
Yeah.
21, how many parents can say that with neurotypical, right? It's like,
Right.
yeah, we've done something right. And so the project has gone at the speed of my son,
Yeah.
for the most part. And I'm not a real good fundraiser. And so we've raised some money for the film, and people can most certainly donate. Any amount makes a difference,
Mm-hmm.
to keep a website up. I don't take a salary from any of that, but it is a hybrid of a project where the
Mm-hmm.
document, a lot of it could be just charitable, but for the feature film, we're really looking at investments, right? And
Mm-hmm.
probably the app will look at investments
Okay.
because we want to take it further.
Yeah.
And under a nonprofit mindset, it's
So
hard.
do you have a site that people can go to contribute?
Yes, it's called
Okay.
embracedmovement.org,
Okay.
as in a hug, embracedmovement.org.
I'm
And
going to be sure to put that in the show notes so
yeah,
that people can open up the show notes and click on the link. And
yeah, yeah. We do have a sample of interviews. It's strictly a sample. It's not intended to be a trailer, although it carries a bit of a narrative just to make it more interesting.
mhm.
At embracedmovement.org/preview.
Okay.
We have that, but it's a very small representation of what we have. And if you're wanting to make a donation, it will go directly to the documentary side of things
Hmm. Hmm.
at this point, so that we can keep. I'm doing some traveling out of my own pocket to get some more interviews
Yeah.
coming up here in April, and we would put that towards travel expenses.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that would be really helpful. You can follow us on just about all of the socials under Embraced FASD. Justin knows more about that, and I'm not very good at it, and Justin is a volunteer at this point. And so he's writing the script on spec, and he started out doing some social media, and he's a busy producer on other films that pay him. So
Hmm.
it's gone at that speed. And
Yeah.
at so if you're wanting to volunteer and help us with fundraising or website or social media, if you want to take our 80 interviews and help us edit things out to 1 minute, I have a couple of them done, but I'm juggling a lot. And so
Well,
you can use
that
all
sounds
sorts
like a
of
call to
volunteers.
action
There you go.
for
So
our watchers. Yes, our viewers.
yeah, and they can
Yeah.
get a hold of me via email within the website under contact. So
Okay.
I just reach out
Perfect.
and say, hey, I want to help out with websites or
Yeah. Yeah.
be an editor and all those kinds of stuff.
And
So,
I think anyone who would want to contribute their time and their expertise, I mean, what an honor it would be to be part of this project. So,
well, I'm overwhelmed that this project has become what it has. That
yeah,
it's like I didn't even know what FASD was 7 years ago, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
so, um, but I think that's a pretty common story. And so
yeah.
this project is really by, with, and for the FASD community.
Hmm.
Has been from day one. And so
Yeah,
my son has helped me do some interviews, and schlepped equipment, and
yeah.
he was involved in actually asking other FASD kids
Hmm.
questions. And we had a set of questions. He says, I have a different question. And he asked one from his perspective. So it it's been collaborative
Yeah,
from
yeah,
every angle, and
yeah,
to get there. And so we're off to the races. We're starting
yeah.
to get real serious about investment side of things, and that's
Hmm.
the focus to get connected. So
Yeah.
if you have a donor advised fund, it can be used as a donation, and it can also be used to help on a project that's making social impact. Those are called
Hmm.
DAFs, DAFs. So if you're a listener and you want to talk about connecting your DAF, your donor advised funds, to this project, we'd love to have that conversation.
Okay.
So,
All right, so we have a couple call to actions there, and I am thrilled just to be able to be one more voice, advancing this project a little bit forward. So hopefully you will get a phenomenal response from this. And Joel, I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your busy schedule, because I do, I have just a hint about how busy you are, and it's amazing. Um, and of course, those of us who are advocating in the FASD space, we tend to be busy people.
well, it comes out
Because
of
there's,
passion, right? Yeah.
yeah, Yeah, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So I'm very excited to have you on this episode, and I would love to have you back as we get further down the line, so you can update everybody and come up with the next call to action. I
Hmm.
think that would be great. And I know I'm going to be having a couple of the other team members on. Jodee's going to, we've had Jodee on once already. We'll have her back on to talk more about her book as it's getting ready to launch within the next, hopefully the next month. And yeah, exciting, exciting stuff. So thank you so much for coming
Well, it's
on.
been a huge honor. Thank you.
Yeah.
Uh, and I look forward to hearing the others talking about the project as well. So
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll definitely be in touch about how soon this is going to be coming out, but it should be coming out in the next couple weeks from the time that we record this. We're still in February. But everybody, thank you for tuning into this episode of Living with FASD. I hope that this has been an inspiring episode for you. Kind of lit the passions for what can you be doing to advance people's understanding and support of the effects of prenatal alcohol exposure. Thank you for tuning in. Come back again next Monday for another episode of Living with FASD. Remember that you can email me at livingwithfasdpodcast@gmail.com and suggest topics or suggest guests or ask questions. Um, and I'll be glad and honored to get back to you. Please like and share. The more people that learn about FASD, the better off all of us are. So thank you once again, and we will see you next week on Living with FASD. Take care, everyone.
thank you.